you are currently working in Israel, but you were working in Paris.
Yes.
And then are you now doing your PhD as you go?
Yeah. So I'm currently at the last year of my PhD, hopefully, um, at the EHESS, EHESS. It's the School of Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. And I'm done with my field work, which occurred in France and Brazil. And now I'm here in Tel Aviv just writing, basically.
Nice.
Yeah.
And can you give us a little bit more information on your PhD? Because like obviously it's like I think I've seen you speak about it maybe once or twice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. So basically, what I study is how coffee is transformed from this very daily, simple product to a quality product, to a quality beverage, much like wine. And I study this transformation all across the supply chain. So my field is sociology, so I don't study, the chemical transformation of coffee or elements of roasting, etc. I don't judge or evaluate quality, but I study kind of the emergence of a culture of quality coffee. And where I chose to conduct this research is specifically France and Brazil. And there's a reason why. Because they both have something in common. They both have sort of a reputation for coffee culture. So in the
Yeah.
case of France, it's Paris, the city of cafes. In the case of Brazil, of course, it's the world's largest coffee producer and exporter. But within the specialty coffee market, they're both not known or considered to produce high quality coffee. Like French coffee is considered, again, from the specialty coffee point of view, to be bad.
Yeah.
And
I'm not agreeing, but I
and
can see why.
yeah, and Brazilian coffee doesn't enjoy a reputation either of being like of the highest quality. So what I study is how this movement, the specialty coffee market, more specifically what we call the third wave, arrives in these places that already have well-established traditions and basically tells them, you guys, you don't know what quality is. Like we're gonna teach you the French how to do your coffee in a different way, how to think about it in a different way. And the same thing occurs in Brazil. And because that engages basically a process of, negotiation and dialogue or opposition, because you got to take into account existing traditions, you got to work with them with the visual codes of the cafe, with what you have in Brazil. It's kind of the history and the surroundings that you have. So I studied this process of like the social construction of quality in these two places and all the kinds of discourses and aesthetics that are mobilized in this process, with a focus on the notions of like quality and authenticity. So that's like the resume,
Yeah.
long resume.
Yeah, for sure. And it's such an interesting thing as well of because you're kind of going from this country in Brazil where they have both cafe culture and growing culture, I guess.
Mm.
And now you're going to France, which obviously has the French Parisian cafe culture. And is there anything you found surprising when you started studying it?
Um, that's a great question. I mean, this whole research was a surprise because when I just started out, the question I started with was the question of the atmosphere of the cafe. I didn't study coffee before for my master's. I studied something completely different, like childhood parenting in Japan.
Were you
And
in coffee? Were you into coffee before you started this PhD?
no, to be honest, I wasn't working in coffee. I worked in restaurants and coffee shops as a waitress. I wasn't a huge coffee drinker. I was really attracted by the cafe space. I'm from Tel Aviv, then I lived in Paris, so I spent all my time in coffee shops. So I got to know kind of the specialty coffee scene as like a customer and not as a barista. And that's really where I started as well. I found this very interesting funding opportunity to study the emergence of, it's called commodities, like emotions as commodities, how you take this thing that's an emotion, you commodify it, you pay for it. So what I started out with was like, what's this thing with people like me who go to coffee shops and pay for the atmosphere? They go there and they pay because it makes them feel good. I started from that, but I wasn't really that intrigued by the question. I was like, okay, so this is like a middle upper class thing, what's going on. And then I got the opportunity, like I got deeper into it. I started talking to baristas. I discovered this whole fascinating world of coffee tastings, terroir.
Yeah.
And then I got to go to Brazil, and the whole, I mean, my whole research changed when I went there. Like I really something clicked, and I really saw this transformation of a product that's much larger than just the question of atmosphere. And I thought that there was something really interesting to be done there, especially taking into account, as you said, like Brazil, where there's like this whole culture that builds around it of consumption, of production, and how that changes also like the relationship of the producer with the coffee, the whole way he looks at the product, or maybe decommodifies it, makes it, charges it with like emotional value for
Yeah.
them. So this whole research came as a surprise from what I started out with, I guess.
Yeah, it's funny because I think a lot of people like the selling point of like how people sell coffee is like being exotic. In Brazil, it's not really there because it's like a thing it's down the road. And for you, just someone wanted to ask, how for your research, how do you define the term quality and how do you define the term authenticity?
Ooh, wow, that's a really hard question. So I don't know how to define quality. I would say that the way that I look um, at quality is not as an objective definition from my point of view. It's not something that's precisely measurable, but I look at how you guys define quality, basically. Like I look at the kind of crossing of this technical definition, the
Mm,
80 points up, I don't know, balance, etc. But I cross that with other notions. For example, kind of the I don't know, the emotional experience of that it makes something that it stirs in you, the whole I don't know, framework in which it is done, the aesthetic codes with which it corresponds. Like I see quality or evaluation of quality as something that is much larger than just the technical definitions. Also, it has to, like, someone's definition of quality has to cater, usually will cater to their class category, for example. So what will be considered high quality in a certain culture or in a certain class group, middle upper class, won't be the same. For example, quality can be considered to be reflective of a specific terroir, like of the terroir, I don't know, the Cerrado Mineiro region in Brazil. While in a different setting, it would be something completely different. So I see it as a very liquid notion that really, really changes. And now authenticity, I've thought more of, and that's a fascinating question, actually, because basically the thing with authenticity, it's a very dominant idea in our culture. Like we search for authenticity in many different places, but we don't always use that word. When we talk about the taste of the land, again, terroir, we talk about authenticity because we assume that there is like something about that champagne that tastes like that has a specific taste that's authentic that should be protected by
yeah.
legal mechanisms. When we talk about transparency and traceability, we talk about authenticity in the sense of authentication, right? When we talk about the story of the producer behind the coffee that we make, that's also a kind of a more romanticized authenticity, or the intent behind the making of the coffee. So authenticity as well is a very, very liquid term. It can mean very different and sometimes contrasting things. It can mean something that's objective, like authentified, or something that is very subjective, like the authentic emotions that it stirs in us or our personal palate. It can be something that's like traditional in the sense of culture, like authentic pizza napolitana is made a certain way, but it can be also like authentic in a natural way that has nothing to do with history, and that can be the exact opposite, like meat that has the authentic taste, like of the raw material. So yeah, something can be authentic because it's like unique and singular. It can also be authentic because, or despite the fact that it's very popular, like when you think about, I know, Oprah Winfrey or Beyonce, like they're
Mm.
considered to be authentic persons, that express themselves authentically, even though they're highly scripted and popular. So the only thing I can say about both is that they're very liquid and they depend on what context they're used in, to
I mean, like,
answer not briefly.
yeah, like, and it's the thing of like when the idea of like how people when they come into a specialty coffee shop for the first time or see prices, it's this idea of like, why do you charge this much? And I remember
Mm.
reading someone saying you're also paying for the story.
Mm.
And like, I guess you probably go into, do you go into this idea as well? Or, because I guess like you researched a lot of it now.
Yeah, yeah. The story is a huge part, of course, of what we pay for. And not, I mean, not only obviously there is the quality in the cup, there is the the whole point of transparency and traceability is to prove to customers that the price is actually justified or even low. But the story around it, I think that's almost become an evidence that when we buy products, we pay for stories because I mean, as consumer societies grew and we had to differentiate between products that are very similar, the only way to differentiate between them is through stories, hence the science of
Yeah.
marketing. And it's not just stories that we tell about goods, it's also the stories that goods tell about us. So, for example, the story of authenticity is not just this product is authentic, but also I can judge it to be authentic, and thus I'm a person capable of discerning authenticity. Thus, my palate is developed. Thus, I'm more knowledgeable, etc., etc. That's why we feel so ashamed when we feel ripped off, because it
Mm.
projects something on us. Now, what I do concerning the stories, for example, is I study how these stories are crafted. So I can take the example of what I studied in Brazil. So I studied two coffee growing regions in Brazil. One is called Cerrado Mineiro, which means in Portuguese the miners' savanna, like a savanna
Oh
of
wow.
miners. And the other is called Caparaó. And these two regions are very, very different. And so they create and they perform very different notions of what's Brazilian specialty coffee. So for example, the region of Caparaó is like a tiny, tiny mountainous region with high altitudes, much like
Okay.
Guatemala, etc. And with smallholders, families that make maybe dozens of bags per year. So they work to craft the story of Brazilian specialty coffee. They work with what they have, with their history and resources and infrastructure, lack of infrastructure that pushes them to do manual picking. And their story is, well, Brazilian coffee can be as good as Guatemalan because we have the biodiversity, we have the conditions, we have the artisanal. And they're working with what they have. And in the case of Cerrado Mineiro, the story is very different because, again, they work with the history of the region and charge it with meaning. And their story is kind of the opposite. It's not Brazilian coffee can also be different, but specialty coffee can be different because Cerrado Mineiro is in Minas Gerais, Brazil's largest coffee producer, and it's kind of notorious in the specialty coffee market for producing like a large-scale mechanized coffee of lower quality.
Mm.
So what specialty coffee farms in this region say is like, look, we can use machines, selective, harvesting machines, to make fantastic, spectacular coffee. We can work with innovation, we can work with mechanization, we can work with technology and enrich the environment. And we can kind of challenge the way that you think about specialty coffee through this Brazilian specialty coffee. Farms like the Terra, for example, are in that region. So these are the kind of questions I get into. I look at not only the fact that there are stories, which is kind of obvious by now, but how these stories are constructed, how they mobilize infrastructures or lack of infrastructures and histories and perceptions and, kind of commodify them into the product, basically.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there was also that thing that people have started doing recently is like putting the names of farmers on bags,
Mm.
which I guess it ties into the authenticity, which I'd say some people say authenticity is almost equal to quality in a way.
Mm. Very
Um,
interesting, yeah.
and like, would you say, how did you research the idea of authenticity in France then compared to Brazil?
Authenticity in what?
In
Oh, in
France.
France. That's a good question. So first of all, with the identity thing, with the names of producers, I think there's another move that's really interesting because, like I saw the Coffee Collective a little while ago, they changed their packaging and they start. I don't think they removed the names of the farmers, but you see less and less companies, for example, using photos of farmers,
Mm.
because I think it's how to represent producers has become problematic with time, with, heightened awareness on social media that it can be either very easily romanticizing poverty with, these images of like black hands holding red cherries,
Yeah.
exoticizing the poor. But on the other hand, presenting too many success stories and like camouflaging the fact that the reality of coffee growing is still, harsh.
Yeah.
So you see like companies like the Coffee Collective, they changed their packaging completely and they're like putting numbers. A lot of companies are putting numbers, and the whole concept of traceability and transparency goes into that as well, like talking less about people and more about things that you can actually authentify, because it's become so touchy to talk about people in a way. And sorry, to answer your actual
No,
question.
that's good.
I mean, yeah. So the question of authenticity in France and Brazil, I don't really compare the two because one is done in the farm level and the other is done in the consumer level. But of course, they mobilize. They both construct stories that are based on history and tradition. In the Brazilian case, they just have to work so much more with the physical environment that they have, with the physical conditions, and they actually have to put so much more effort into creating a story of authentic Brazilian coffee, because there are a few things. Like in Paris, for example, most roasters, they operate alone, right? They're not trying to brand. They don't need to brand Parisian specialty coffee or French
Yeah.
specialty coffee. They need to brand themselves, like against against other coffee shops, basically. So some of them, the ones who do want to like expand, they do play this, we're doing authentic French specialty coffee. They leverage tradition. For example, coffee shops that buy old bistros, or that change the word from barista to cafelier, like sommelier.
Yeah.
So some coffee shops, like they play on this idea of authenticity through tradition, like our coffee harks back to this artisanal, traditional past and continues the tradition of French terroir, etc., etc. But it's much less present in France because, again, they don't need to group together. They don't need to change the perception. They basically need to compete against each other, again, unless they really want to grow and export their model overseas, which has been the case for 3 places, I think, or
Yeah.
4. And in Brazil, it's really a necessity because you have a lot of small producers that are grouped together, and some through importers or exporters. And then there is the need to talk about regional or Brazilian coffee. And then you get all of this idea of authenticity through terroir as well, to talk about Brazilian terroir. Then there comes the stage of protecting it legally as well. Um, Designations of origin, appellations of origin, like
Okay.
legal systems taken from wine, like Champagne or Parmigiano Reggiano, that are applied to coffee. And that's a form of authenticity as well. It's like, it's saying, this is authentic Cerrado Mineiro coffee, and if someone claims that they're doing authentic Cerrado Mineiro coffee, we can sue them.
Yeah.
So that's protecting authenticity through informational infrastructures, basically. So
Yeah.
very, very different constellations.
Yeah. And I think it was, I can't remember what company it was. It might have been Brazilian Coffee that had the farmer with the donkey as their representation of like this authentic Brazilian coffee was represented by this. Uh,
Was it? I think I know what you're talking about. I don't know if it was Brazilian or Colombian.
yeah, it's something I can't remember which country it was from, but it was like this idea of like the guy with the kind of the clothes that were a little bit torn and looked like weather beaten and kind of stuff. And it was like this is going to be good because of this representation of the coffee.
Yeah, yeah, it's people. I mean, that's a very problematic aspect of the search for authenticity. It's like people as qualifiers of authenticity. This is
Yeah.
something we don't think about so much, but for example, when we go to a restaurant and we brag that we've found an authentic Chinese restaurant because all the clients are Chinese, or
Yeah.
all the waiters are Chinese or look Chinese. And again, I mean, I look for places that are close to what I've tasted in my travels. Obviously, it's not a bad thing, but at the same time, it makes people part of the setting, it makes people part of the product, and there is an element of how do you say, objectification to
Objectification.
it, objectification to it as well. Yeah.
And did you go into mainly like did you just go into spaces or did you also go into further into stuff as well? Like
What do you mean?
so like you spoke about like how in France you focused on the space of the cafe and
Mm,
the idea of the authentic cafe and the quality of the cafe was kind of
yeah.
being defined by space. Did you also do kind of as you said like when the people around it who are involved and kind of the history to it and that kind of thing when you go into a French inspired cafe they have French words
Mm.
on the wall.
Yeah, I mean, I looked a lot into design. In the French case, the design of coffee shops again is a way of of localizing or making specialty coffee local because again, that's a big part of the challenge. Once the specialty coffee market arrives in a new country in Europe, and it seeks to grow beyond the base of like expats basically, or expat
Hmm.
oriented, then they I mean they will need to dialogue in a way or another with a local code. So one way to do it, of course, is through the palette, roasting darker, for example. But another way to do it, which is very influential, is through design to make spaces that reminiscent of what people already know. So put the little zinc bar, well, the big zinc bars or the chairs outside to make people feel that okay, this is something that we know. This and of course it impacts also the perception of taste. There's a fantastic sensory scientist called Fabiana Carvalho that does a lot of research about that, about how things like the cup size and the cup color
Oh yeah.
impact perception of taste. So I mean, I haven't looked into that, but it plays into our perception, it plays into our experience. So I do look at the physical elements. And again, like a lot of people tend to criticize the kind of Scandi cafes or aesthetic in places like Paris, saying they all look the same, these white spaces with the wooden floors and the tropical plants. I don't tend to criticize it. I think it makes sense. I think it's a way to convey to consumers, especially in the beginning, that there is something new here, something that they've seen elsewhere and now has gotten here, because how do you choose as a client when you're just walking down the street and you don't know that this place is going to sell good coffee. So visuals are strong communicators on identity and on how to negotiate the local and the global,
Yeah.
and make people feel more, welcome, excluded, included, etc.
And for you, you said you used a lot of the kind of the local and the glocal thing. Could you
Yeah.
explain like localization?
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
I talked a little about localization at a certain point. So basically, it's an old idea by now from the 90s in social sciences that if we used to talk about the kind of homogenizing power of globalization, how everything becomes the same, there has been a realization more and more that we're seeing more and more global phenomenons, meaning the encounter of the global and the local. And that the global doesn't necessarily just swallow up everything and makes everything the same, but that there are always all kinds of adaptations or counter reactions to globalization. So a good example of a global company that integrated some of it is McDonald's.
Oh yes.
It's a global company, but everywhere they go, they make small adaptations. So they'll do like Mech shawarma in I don't know where in in Lebanon and Syria. They'll do Mech croissant in France, and this is always has been explained as a part of their success. And companies that haven't been able to do that, like for example Starbucks, failed miserably in Israel. And part of why they're said to have failed is because they didn't do any adaptations. The first round they were here, they didn't adapt themselves to the local palates and aesthetics and codes at all.
Nice.
Someone's asking, where are your masks? I'm
We're
home
both at
alone.
home.
I'm home alone. I think it's okay. It qualifies. You're so close.
We're very
So
far.
we're very far. We're in different continents,
Yeah, right now
actually.
anyway.
Yeah,
I
right
think it's
now.
like nighttime for you as well.
Yeah, and you guys probably are. I see people from Brazil and Syria and Lebanon and everything. Anyway, so this is the notion of globalization, and I think to add something that's not precisely coffee, the interplay between global and local is really interesting during COVID, because
Mm,
of course what's happening is that the notion of globalization is being challenged, or we're seeing kind of the harm done by globalization as viruses are spreading very quickly, as suddenly we're becoming very interested in the source of the goods that we're consuming, right? We're talking about local consumption, agriculture, blah, blah, blah. And the interesting thing is that the people that are really advocating for this kind of local consumption discourse thing are precisely those us, the global elites that benefit from from this discourse of globalization. So the interplay between global and local is so interesting, I
yeah.
think.
Yeah, because I guess like I believe I remember when Starbucks was trying to do that thing where they were trying to get the different drinks that would be local to the area, but which they
Mm.
tried like a couple of years ago, but it didn't work at all. And I was I think I was reading something about how McDonald's, as you said, did this thing where they would take over, also do this thing about space where they would take over like old businesses or buildings that were derelict, but were like very famous or very like almost heritage sites, and then
Yeah.
just kind of work around it, but put the McDonald's stuff in.
Yeah, that's something that's become more and more common as a way to create value in again as margins from like goods from the global south have decreased. We just have to come up with new ways and new ways to justify prices and to distinguish between like standard goods and special or unique goods.
Yeah.
So we do that, for example, through leveraging the past and nostalgia and the old and the ancient. And then we say, oh, this is just old and this is vintage, and we give the vintage, this is an old car and this is a vintage car. This is an old house and this is a conservation fit house. And of course,
Mm.
there's a history and good reasons behind these things. It's not completely made up, but we use these things to attribute a value, symbolic value that justifies economic value. And where we see a lot of this process of the valuation of the old and the antique is in the process of gentrification. The process of gentrification, I'm guessing some people don't necessarily know the word. It's like this thing where neighborhoods that are not located in the center of cities become kind of the same. For example, you have like a you know. Neighborhoods in the outskirts of New York. Brooklyn is a great example that initially are populated with populations of disempowered socioeconomic background, but through time become attractive precisely because of the authenticity of the poverty of these neighborhoods, the authenticity of the old houses, and then you have young artists that start going to these neighborhoods, moving in. They don't have money, but they're also attracted to kind of the romanticism of the
Mm.
old and of the poor. And what has happened is that at some point, real estate developers took notice and decided that this can add value to these places, to Brooklyn, etc. And so start investing, start buying out places, and first there are the young artists, then the coffee shops come, then the Starbucks come, then the initial residents that made these neighborhoods so authentic and so alluring are pushed out even further, and that's
Yeah.
called gentrification, basically. Yeah.
And would you say there's what would be the most common like localization of specialty coffee?
What would be the most common localization? What do you mean?
As in, like, what would be the more like common tropes of globalization, like localization within coffee, that you have seen like within French cafes? So would they like, um, so the trend, making the authenticity of the local area, like, is there any common themes you saw people do?
Um, I wouldn't say common themes. Um, I would say some engage in this thing of globalization and not everyone does. It's more like that there's diversity, that some coffee shops really keep the Scandi thing and even take it, dial it up to the extreme, while
Yeah.
others really try to immerse. And so globalization is more like how do you say, like a gray area on which people are situated. Um, I don't know. It's hard to say through the palate. I mean, through the palate is a good example, like roasting styles from the very extremely, acidic to something that's more dark in roasting.
Yeah.
So you really see a big diversity of approaches to it. There isn't just one or the other.
So I've got some questions here.
Yeah.
What is the goal of Noah's study?
Yeah, that's a good question. And where are my goggles? What's the goal of my study? So basically, that's a good question. What I what I want to do first of all is understand this process of redefining coffee. But again, for me, it's not just about coffee. Coffee is just a great example because it touches on so many different things and it connects to so many different worlds. So by understanding how the notion of quality is redefined and how that has to do with economic structures and social structures, maybe we can understand or say something about value creation more generally speaking, and the links of those to economic regimes. For example, I see specialty coffee as well as other practices like sourdough baking and
Mm.
meditation, and their discourse of authenticity is like kind of continuing this kind of we call it neoliberal discourse of growing the self through consumption. What we call it's a big word. The neoliberal discourse is just this idea of bringing together psychology and capitalism, like through introspection, through tasting, through getting to know myself, through my palate, through meditation, through baking. I also grow. And the
Yeah.
idea is always to grow, 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 which is, of course, the foundation of the capitalist system. So these things that can at first appear like countercultures, consumption or brewing of specialty coffee, sourdough baking, meditation in its westernized form, actually in a way kind of continue this kind of capitalist logic of we as people are responsible for our own destiny, for our own happiness, for our growth, which kind of can deflect attention from societal or economic structures or
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So that would be like I don't know if that answers the question of a goal, but that's a research goal. In terms of goal, like what I want to do with it is I want to make this kind of information plus more like fun information like history accessible. I think in academia we often tend to like stick with our own, not communicate our findings very much. And so what I try to do is to do lectures, talks like this,
Yeah.
and even if I speak like in high terms, those who are interested can at least get some new perspective, a sociological perspective, which can make you think about your decisions differently.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like I haven't. I've read a lot of like back when I was still making coffee on bar. I read so much about how the science of coffee, the chemistry of coffee, the business dynamics of coffee. But for me, it
Mm.
was like even how people knew of the social structures of how to act in a coffee shop. What they saw, like if you like even walking around the town, you could decide what coffee
Mm.
shop you went into by how busy it is, the decor, the smell of it, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's
Being aware of again, this is the power of anthropology specifically. I mean,
mm,
okay, so there is the awareness of power structures and how our choices, including in design, make some people feel more welcome, how we participate in larger processes like gentrification and what we can do with it, how we can make people feel more welcome. Also, just knowledge of, things in the history of coffee that still endure, like the heritage of colonialism or inequality across supply chains. So the larger questions that have to do with coffee is one thing. And then there are the lived experiences of people that you just don't get heard. They just don't get heard as much. And like for example, when people talk about the farmer, how
Yeah.
the farmer or the producer is, perceives or what they want. As an anthropologist, you go and you talk to a lot of people in an anonymous manner in their language. You collect those testimonies and you show that there is diversity or that there are options. You know what I mean? There is
Yeah.
sometimes a language barrier as well. The case of Brazil is not as hard because a lot of people speak English, but it's like you take all these testimonies that people wouldn't express so comfortably with a buyer also because buyers want
Yeah.
to and not want to hear certain things, or producers think that they don't want to. So you can take these things and you can bring those voices and add like context or interpretations and just show, for example, just one example of something that I sometimes tell buyer friends, like a lot of producers in Brazil talk to me about, especially the more successful ones, about how when buyers come, they expect a hosting experience. They expect the producers to spend a lot of time with them and always be nice and always smile and never frown. And if a producer ever gets to go to a consuming country, they never or rarely get the same treatment. It's like, okay, welcome
Mm.
to welcome to Paris. Here's a
Yeah.
map. Enjoy your
Yeah.
weekend. Well, if you're a buyer and you go to Brazil, I mean, you're not independent as well. They spend their weekends, they open their houses. Often they operate like sort of places from their houses. And yeah, so these kind of things that producers are not gonna say, kind of the emotional labor or the hospitality that's required, and that's not always gonna be said
Yeah.
directly.
And yeah, I agree, like with the whole like thing of like romanticizing that whole
Mm.
area as well. Like you read the description of a farm and it's like, oh, it's on the side of a hill overlooking like the sunset or something like that. Uh, and it's just all this like they sometimes don't even talk about the pickers, they just talk about the farmer.
Yeah, and though the visual side of it is interesting because often these farms are very, very beautiful. That's a lot of the work that gets put into fabricating, specialty coffee. But again, I mean, it just I would say just problematic to choose a farm just because the farm is beautiful, because there is
Mm.
spatial inequality here. Not everyone gets born to families or get the luck to have farms situated like on the most beautiful hills in Colombia with the best views. Should
You're
that
breaking
be?
up slightly.
Oh,
Oh yeah, I was just being very pixely.
oh, is it better?
I think it's better, maybe a little bit. You're very
What I meant.
pixelated.
Oh shit.
It could be
Might
both of
be,
us.
could be me. Yeah, sorry. Is it good enough to go on, or should I try to do something like charge the phone?
We can definitely still hear you, which is good. Uh, but you're just very pixelated.
Uh, Shit. Okay. Do you
Okay,
want me to
so
log out and log back in, or is it okay?
I think maybe if you log out and log back in, it should be okay.
Okay.
You can try
I'll
it.
do that.
Okay. So if you have any questions, you should ask them in the question box at the bottom. Yay, much better.
Hi, welcome back.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think some people put some
Ask more
questions.
questions?
Yeah.
Cool.
So someone's asked if you can talk about how the specialty coffee experience in Rio or Sao Paulo, I don't know if you went to these places as well, is different to that of Paris.
Sure. I did spend a lot of time in Sao Paulo, not Rio. I've only spent a day in Rio. Brazil, generally speaking, is just an insane place for specialty coffee. It's like nowhere else in the world because it has
Mm.
not only it's not only a producing country and not only a consuming country, becoming one of the largest in the world. I think it's going to surpass the United States in terms of total value. It's a leader in research as well. From the beginning of the 20th century, the Instituto Agronômico de Campinas, the Agronomical Institute of Campinas, has been researching like plant varieties. So you have just an insane amount of like buzz and activity happening there all the time, just like events every day. When I was there doing fieldwork, I just had like 3 events all over the country to attend that I didn't, of course, I didn't have the money to just fly. But it's very, very buzzing. And what's also unique about Brazil is that they don't get a lot of exposure in terms of palate, because in Brazil, you basically can only get like a Brazilian green coffee. There are limitations on
Yeah,
importing.
the importing, you can't import raw at all, raw green
Yeah, yeah,
coffee.
not at all. Just like roasted and not of high quality. So a lot of people just know Brazilian coffee, which is of course something that it could be lacking for developing your palate and sensibilities. But on the other hand, there is a sense of like national pride in Brazilian coffee, which in a way France doesn't have as much. Not the specialty coffee market. There isn't this sense of like pride in French coffee. It's more like about opposition.
Yeah.
Like the French coffee is so bad, and we're doing something different. Look, like we're doing it like here and there, or we're giving it a new twist, but in Brazil, there's much more of a national kind of pride element to it, and Sao Paulo as well, like specifically. It's an amazing, amazing city. I miss it very much.
And do you think like would people say if they were in a coffee shop, would they go for the Brazilian coffee over, say, a Kenyan coffee or something like that?
I mean, I haven't done like consumer, I haven't done surveys, so I don't know what people actually order. What I study is like kind of like this discourse of specialty coffee professionals. So
Mm.
in the specialty coffee industry, obviously there are misconceptions, like when Emi Fukuhari won with a Brazilian coffee, the Terra, like the whole media around it was like, oh, she won with like a Brazilian coffee, and it was like a big shock. It was a big, big shock. And she said in interviews as well, her and Mathieu, they were like, we couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe that this was Brazil, because everything we tasted thus far was like nuts and chocolate, you
Yeah.
know? Consumers, I don't know, because if you really just have consumers take surveys and ask them what they drink, probably most of them don't know what they drink. Maybe some of them go for Brazil because it fits their espresso. Also, I don't think people outside specialty coffee necessarily know how badly Brazil is perceived in the specialty coffee market, because like Brazilian coffee is used by companies like Starbucks in their blends and Illy. And it was actually, I just discovered writing my PhD that it was actually considered to be like the highest quality coffee in the beginning of the 20th century, when coffee was like judged by handsomeness, because the
Mm.
Brazilian beans were extremely beautiful. They were brown and shiny and uniform for different reasons. And that changed when like California-based roasters that only had access to the Caribbean easily, not to the Atlantic where Brazil is. Um, they decided to invent cupping in the 20th century, in the 20s of the 20th century, and privilege like the quality in the cup and the aromatic profile, and that's where like ugly beans
Yeah.
from Central America suddenly become like privileged for their, valued for their quality. Before that, it was Brazil, because it's like prettier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, I never didn't know that about the handsomeness of the bean kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah, that used to be a thing. I mean, how pretty the beans are, and you know, no one complained about Brazilian coffee being too nutty.
And have you seen even a shift in the shift in the perception of both French and Brazilian coffee culture in the last few years from your research?
Um, Again, I couldn't say for sure because I didn't do worldwide surveys to say how it was before and what people think today, but you can just see in terms of coverage and numbers, of course, there's a growth. And when there's growth, it means that something is working well. And definitely in the discourse about French coffee, there are all these articles. How did French coffee move from being so bad to so good? Brazil is winning competitions, so that's not that new. Brazil has been winning competitions for a while. I think Klaus Thompson
Mm.
won with it as well years back, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely like at least in the discourse about it, there's a shift. But in the very small world of specialty coffee media, again, I'm not actually that interested in what really changes in terms of what people perceive, but more how these changes are done. I'm looking
Okay.
really at the industry and the industry side and to see which worlds are leveraged, which ideas are leveraged to change the way we think about something. Whether that holds in reality, really hard to tell. You'd really have to make like really large scale surveys, which is what companies like Allegra do. Like just ask a lot of people, what do you think? How would you rank this and this and this and this coffee? And then come back a few years later and ask them again and
Yeah.
ask them again. And then you can really say, okay, so something in public perception about this has shifted. Otherwise, it's just speculations, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And could you give
Yeah.
like an example of maybe idea of like how you researched like maybe the idea of coffee quality in France?
Sure. So what I do, like what we call my methodology, is I conduct interviews, observations, and I analyze materials. So I talk to a lot of coffee professionals in France. I try to talk to at least like the owners of the coffee shops and the roasters and some baristas and judges, etc. And ask them different questions from more direct ones like what is their idea of good coffee, what constitutes specialty, to just like more easy flowing conversations. And just I spent a lot of time with, I just spent a lot of time with them. And then in Brazil it was the same. I visited like 30 farms and just talked to people a lot. And then
Yeah.
I listened to what they say. I looked at what they did. I looked where they put the attention in terms of infrastructure. I talked to them about their transition, about this process of having discovered specialty coffee, what it means to them. And from that, you kind of take out or analyze their ideas or their notions of like quality and authenticity. The confusions as well, or what they rely on, what sources they rely on. Oftentimes, smaller, newer producers would like kind of rely on notes, on scores, because they have no idea what constitutes quality for the consumer. They have no idea. So they just like, okay, my coffee is graded 88 or 90, so that's quality coffee, that's good coffee. The more experienced ones, for example, that have been abroad especially, they would understand quality in the wider sense of like the experience that goes into it, the story that is crafted into it, the user experience, like the visitor experience. So that would change a lot as well. And you kind of need to pay attention also to socioeconomic factors. Has this person spent time abroad? Does this person speak English? Does he have the economic resources, et cetera, et cetera? That plays a lot into what people understand as quality, definitely.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's an interesting one. And then I do analysis of media coverage, things that have been written on French coffee by French coffee professionals and Brazilian. Yeah, that's pretty much it. A lot of data collection. And
Sounds like you've done a lot of research.
yeah, I did. I still here in Tel Aviv, I spend all my time in coffee shops, and even though I don't officially do research here. Yeah, but Brazil was intense. I came back to twice, and I spent 2 months each time, and again 30 farms, and I studied Portuguese. Of course, I
Mm.
studied French. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of work behind it, and still it's not representative. It's more studying symbolic processes and representations. been saying everyone is like this, you know.
So
Yeah.
we're almost finished, but I've got one or
Yeah.
two more questions for you. So where have you drank your best coffee?
I did have the privilege of drinking some very good coffees. I wouldn't say that there is one. Um, I mean, I got to try a few competition coffees. So I got to try Emmy's winning coffee because I was in Brazil when she won. So the Doterra carbonic maceration coffee developed with Lomi. So that was also kind of unique for me because it's a French roaster collaborating with a Brazilian farm, and I know both. So it was a great coffee. One of my first experiences as well. So like, wow, banana, that's amazing. So I drank it there, and then I drank it again in Norway when I was visiting Supremo roasters, coffee roasters, and that was a lovely coffee. And then I got to drink a few other really good ones. I mean, I can give the cliche answer of like the best coffee that I was like the memory of this and that. No, I got to try some really, really nice competition coffee and it was great, and I'm very, very happy to have had that experience. So
Nice.
yeah, so probably in Brazil.
So good. Also had coffee in Brazil and it was amazing.
Right?
Brazil, it's so good.
There is good coffee in Brazil.
Yeah. Oh no. I'm gonna wait till she comes back. Oh no, Noah. Just gonna wait till she gets back. I know, Stephen. So sad. Hey, we got her back. We got
I
you
think
back.
my phone, yeah, I think my phone is like at the end of its life, not like
Oh,
battery, but like life.
oh
So
no.
it got too warm. Sorry, guys and ladies.
So yeah, just before we finish up, do you want why you chose France and Brazil in particular?
Well, to be honest, I initially chose France. I was there. I was already living in France,
Mm,
and I became interested in the culture of cafes. And then when I chose it and I decided to expand the supply chain, I figured that Brazil was an interesting place because it also had this thing with like being positioned relatively low down the quality valuation
yeah, and
scale. Yeah,
yeah, and I would know we already went into it with the ideas of heritage and kind of
yeah,
history and stuff like that.
yeah.
But I guess were you already living in France when you decided on France?
I mean, I just kind of, uh, I lived in France for 7 years, uh, and I've been living there for a few years before that. I did my master's degree in France, again, on like a Japanese demography, on Japanese parents with one child, an only child. So it was very convenient for me to continue my fieldwork there, but I really, really wanted to expand my research to a producing country as well.
Mm,
Yeah, yeah.
nice. And do you have any like finishing statements about your PhD or anything like that?
No, just thank you everyone for tuning in. And thank you for inviting me. It's
Yeah, of
it's a
course.
pleasure.
No, I
Yeah.
was very excited to invite you because obviously I've done a little bit of research into sociology of like coffee and the coffee culture and how
Yeah.
it all works, and like the power dynamics of kind of how cafes work and Foucault and everything like that. Um, so I was very interested to see you on this, so that was great. And I'm sure if we gave
Yeah.
this more time, we would be here for hours. Um, but we,
Sure, sure as well.
but we are going to put this up on YouTube if people have like want to watch it again about some questions that you answered.
Oh, cool.
We're also going to be putting on our IGTV, so our Instagram TV area, so people can watch it too. You should also go follow Noah on her Instagram because you've currently just gotten into back to Israel, and I've already seen you in lots of beautiful cafes.
Yeah, but I also try to post on my Instagram informative posts with little snippets of history, coffee history that I don't, again, it's not my own research. I usually like summarize other people's research. But anything that anyone would like to know about coffee related, that's again not like the hard science, but more the culture and history, I'm always very happy to share
Hmm.
the work of others. There are amazing scholars doing amazing work in coffee history and anthropology and sociology, and I'm just one of many. And I'm always really happy to share recommendations. So really
Yay!
feel free. Feel free. You can also, yeah, yeah, you can write me a message and I'll send you an email and all of that.
All right. Okay. Well, I hope you have a good evening now and you don't melt.
You
So,
too.
oh yeah, no, it's gonna happen.
And I hope I see you soon in Europe. I need
Yes.
to get back to France at some point.
Yeah. Well, hopefully everything goes well in Europe over the next couple of months. All right. Thank you so much, Noah. Have a lovely
Thank you,
evening.
Susie. You too,
Thank
and
you,
stay safe.
everyone.